Okay, so we talked about um, using this roundup function, and we created this function ourselves. It was a custom function to round up an input number. And remember, we declared it as public and function. Just a second, let me adjust this. And we used the by val, and I explained that gives you a copy of the value of whatever is being input in here. So over here, for example, we're inputting subtotal. Remember, subtotal came from here, and we're inputting subtotal, but when we run this, I'm sorry, where was it? Here, subtotal. But when we run this roundup function and we do some calculations involving subtotal, this subtotal is not changed. We just get the value of this, put it in here, and do some calculations with it, and put that result in text, but this value is not changed. So we said that this subtotal here is actually a local variable here, because the input is a local variable, and because it's by value, we're not changing the variable out here. Okay, and then we said this is a function, and the as integer part we explained is going to remember that a function has an output, and this tells what the data type or the type that the output is going to be. So it's going to be an integer, so it's going to output an integer. So it's going to round something up and give you a result, and that result is going to be an integer. And we had this is a local variable, output, as integer, and we take our input, whatever was input, and we apply the int function to it. But first we add half to it. We apply the int function, and then that is output. That is our output. And then here we're returning the output. And we also mentioned that there's another way to return output, and that is where was that? Here, if you would say that was output equals the name of the function, that would serve the same purpose. So if I did, instead of writing this symbol here, instead of writing return output, if I said output, or if I wrote roundup equals output instead of return output, that would give us the same result. Okay, so that's a review. He says the roundup function takes in one parameter. So it just takes in one parameter. There's no comma in here to indicate that we could have two parameters. It's by value. That means it gets a copy. Calls its copy by a local name input. So what he means by that is whatever we're going to put in here, it's going to, within this function, it's going to be referred to as input. So whatever we put in goes in here, actually. So it's referred to by a local name input. It rounds input up in two steps. First it adds a half and then truncates the result. Okay, so I'm not going to go into exactly what that is, the mathematics of that, but I think you can figure it out. It stores the results in a local variable called output. This is a local variable because it's declared inside this function using the dim statement, and uses the return keyword to return output to the point of call. So remember, this function is defined here, but it's called here. We use it here. We define it here, but we haven't used it yet. That's something you have to sort of think about or remember. You define the function here, but you use it. Just because you've defined it doesn't mean you've bothered to use it, but you decide to use it, and you use it here. It doesn't have to be defined up here in order to use it here. You can define it down here. The Visual Basic will, or the compiler will first check to see where it's defined, and it'll go through all of this and say, oh, here it is, and then it will use it here. Okay? So it uses the return keyword to return output to the point of call. So the point of call is right here. So it goes here, into tax. Okay? Okay, we're talking about local variables. We've talked about this before. Recall that a variable scope refers to its range of visibility. This means where it's visible, i.e. available for use. Okay, and we saw all of this before. So we have a class level variable here, which is public. So it's class level because it's defined up here. The accessibility is public. Remember, we talked about what the accessibility means. So if it's public, it's available to all anything in the project. And then here, I'm sorry, no, it's available to anything within the class. If it's here, it's local. It's only within the method. This is a method, right? And then we can even define it here. Then it's only available within the block. And then that's why we need, this is only available here. Then we have to redefine it here because we didn't define it out here somewhere. We defined it within this block. So it's gone once we get to else. So if we want to use the same kind of variable again, we'd have to, if we want to refer to something called grade again, we'd have to redefine it. Okay, now we're going to talk about your homework, the day action project. So let's make a project with a more complex custom function. So we have a new job, make a simple VB tool to predict a person's activities. Okay, so we saw what we're going to make. We saw that it's over here. So it works like this. It has this sliding toolbar, sliding bar here, which is just another control that you can use. So that's not important really. But anyway, it has this sliding button here, or tool here, and but it outputs depending on where you slide it to something different. So it seems relatively like a simple project, but we're going to use some new technology or some new concepts. So we have the day action project, the one that we just looked at. So given an input time, so we're going to slide the slider to a particular place, and that's going to decide the input time. We are asked to predict, not really predict, but just to output one of 8 user activity states. Okay, so the activity states, it just means the user could be asleep, getting ready for work, traveling to work, these different things, preparing for sleep. Okay, so our plan. He says we're going to encapsulate our prediction algorithm in a custom function. So in other words, we're just going to make a custom function to do all of this for us. And then we're going to call that function, and which predicts and returns the state. So the state just means, is the person asleep? Is it getting ready for work? And so on. Sounds easy. Oh wait, we have a little problem. How do we conveniently represent actions using a VB variable? So these are the different actions. How can we how can we do this? How can we create a variable that can take on these different values, is what he's talking about. Now you don't have to have a variable that's taking on these different values. You can just use an if statement. You could say if it's 1, then it's asleep. If the slider is in position 1, then he's asleep. If it's in position 2, then he's getting ready for work and so on. But he wants to do this in a slightly different way. He wants to basically make a new variable that can just take these values. So, normally we have variables that can be an integer, and then they can take on lots of different values. In other words, all the different integers that we can consider. Or we've also seen Boolean variables that can only take on true or false. But he wants to find a new variable that can only take on these, how many are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. These 8 different values. He calls them activity states, but anyway, 8 different values. So his plan is to encapsulate our prediction algorithm in a custom function, but he says, how do we conveniently, here's the key word, conveniently. In other words, there's lots of ways to do it, but he's going to give you one way to do it. Represent actions, represent this stuff using a VB variable. Can't we just use an integer, he says. Why integers are a problem here. Our problem, how do we conveniently represent actions, or the different values that the variable can take? So I call this this type of variable, I call it a categorical variable, or a non-numeric variable. So a non-numeric variable, like another example would be like, what's your favorite color? So you could have the choices red, blue, yellow, green, and purple. So that would be called a categorical variable. The favorite color would be the name of the variable, and that variable wouldn't take on values like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or 1.5 and 1.44 and so on. It wouldn't take on any kind of numeric values. It would take on the values red, blue, purple, green, and yellow, whatever I said. Okay, so that's called a categorical variable, or it's also called a qualitative variable instead of a quantitative. Quantitative would be a numeric variable, but this would be called a qualitative variable or categorical variable. So he says, why can't we just use an integer? Problem 1, we will want to limit values to an allowed range. Okay, so if we are going to use an integer, we don't want it, we sort of want to prevent, so we only have 8 states, or 8 different values we're going to allow. So we don't want to have lots of different, even if we were going to use integers somehow, we would only want to allow 8 possibilities. So, it's just, as I said, it's a matter of convenience. To prevent returning bad values that don't correspond to any action. He says, however, the data types we've used so far don't really support this. For example, an integer variable can take any reasonably sized integer value. So we talked about it. I think, I forget what we said, but it was a lot. I think it was 2.5 million on each side. In other words, 2.5 positive integers and 2.5 million negative. So that's a lot more than just 8 values. For these so-called day actions, in other words, these things, asleep, getting ready for work, traveling, the data types so far we've used don't really support this. Sorry, I read that already. For day actions, we can choose to use only 0 through 7, but actually a returned value of 1,000 or minus 15 will also be allowed by VB. Now, there are other ways to handle this, but this is one way. This lack of robustness versus crazy values could be a real problem. We will also want to assign meaningful value names. For example, does current action equals 4 seem very meaningful? Well, I mean, it could be, as long as you know what 4 means. So if you meant by 4 this one at work, then sure, it's okay. But he wants to make it sort of more clear. Instead of using 4, he wants to have a kind of meaningful name. Okay. This could also, not really, which day action corresponds to the number 4. This could also lead to problems. So integers are useful, but limited. Safe use will be pretty tricky here. So to do this, he's trying to just make something convenient. Fortunately, VB has an easy solution for such situations. We can make our own custom data type. Okay, so we're going to make our own special data type, and it's only going to take on these values. So we could say they're kind of string values or categorical values, as I said before. And we're going to create a variable that can only take on these values. So that could be useful. And this type of, this is called an enumeration. So it's a custom data type. Okay, I'll stop here and make a new video.